Hey, what's up? Gleb, Alexandrov here for CreativeShrimp.com. Presenting your carefully created 3D models in the way that makes people drool is very important. Okay, so here's what happened. Jerry Perkins aka MasterXeon asked me if I would be interested in rendering this awesome padded pod asset in my own way. Of course I said hell yeah, because I love rendering hard surface stuff. And also I love hard DOPS add-on, so this was no-brainer for me. So this is not a regular Creative Shrimp tutorial, this is rather, how should I call it, a making of video. Here you see the animation that I made, and I will reverse engineer it for you in this video and walk you through all stages of my workflow, the things that I usually do with lighting, rendering, choosing the camera angle, post-production, clean up and optimizing the scene, pretty much all elements of my workflow, everything you wanted to know. I will get started by taking a brief look at the model, obviously. Here we'll be dealing with the awesome padded pod model by MasterXeon. It consists of 38 objects, it has approximately 2.5 million vertices and 3.5 million faces. It's definitely a very high poly and a high quality model. And what I want to do before even thinking about visualizing it somehow, I want to clean up and optimize the model. So I'm clicking on the different parts, checking their modifiers and stuff like that, looking at the poly count, and it's always good to know what kind of poly count your PC can handle. Next, I usually try to optimize the geometry. For example, this spline has excessive amount of segments, I think. What we can do is reduce the resolution of the spline, and especially if it's not your own model, it's better to investigate these issues before rendering. I will also collapse the modifier stack, I think. Alt-C, mesh from curve, meta, serif, text. Of course, it will make our workflow, say, more destructive, but at the same time, it will help to reduce the clutter and help to keep entropy at bay. I'm repeating this mantra over and over again, just keep it simple. Another cool thing to do is split the objects in layers, so I will duplicate this soft pod by pressing Shift D, then press M and select layer number 8. Essentially, that will copy this cloth object to layer number 8. And then I will go back to layer number 1 and decimate the hell out of this model. I love having very responsive, very fluent viewport during lighting, stage and rendering. So optimizing the geometry is one of the ways to make sure your viewport is updating at a very fast rate. And here you can see the original geometry, non-decimated, very dense. The polygon size is almost sub-pixel. And here is the decimation ratio of 0.1. And it's very hard to tell the difference, right? This will be the decimation ratio for our main model, and this is 0.01. Very low poly model, I call it a proxy model. We will be using it mainly for the distant object, stuff like that, or yeah, use it as a proxy, to replace it later on with the high poly model. So entropy is probably one of my biggest fears and my biggest enemies. Every project that you do wants to fall in chaos. The forces of chaos just try to rip everything apart, you know, and you have to invent the smart ways to organize your scene. For example, by splitting it into different layers and managing each layer individually. Right, so to reiterate the point, here I have the scene broken into 3 layers, basically. Layer number 8 with the full res geometry, layer number 2 with the decimated geometry. When the time will come, I will replace the proxy geometry with the full resolution geometry. But first, I want to make sure that everything looks great. I think that's the point. Right, let's set up a basic lighting. And what I mean is really basic, like one light source. By default, we have the environment lighting enabled. Let's jump into the cycles rendered mode. Actually, it's great that Jerry has set up the materials for us. Everything works, it seems. Right, let's take a look at the rendering settings now. For the preliminary renders and for the viewport, I will keep the bounces at 0, because it doesn't really contribute a lot to the final look. Just keep it simple and keep it fast and fluent. and everything will be alright. And here we have the area light sources, very big, very soft, hitting the object from behind because the object is highly reflective, and I want to reveal this reflective component in the most prominent way by introducing the backlighting. When we render metal or stuff like that, it's a good place to start. Okay, so we've talked about simplifying geometry. It's also important to simplify the shaders, because the complex shaders mean longer render times, the sluggish viewport update, and especially when I have no idea about the shot in general, about camera angle, about lighting angles, I try to stick to very simple and uncluttered materials. So for example, here we have a bunch of materials: Kevlar, chrome, plastic, and some of them are pretty complex. If you hit tab, you can enter the group and check it out. It has a subsurface scattering component and it looks great, but I think we can safely replace it with a simpler shader, especially if you have a lower-end computer or, goodness gracious, a laptop. That is way to go. And again, I think a very good habit of 3D artists is to keep workflow iterative, and then gradually build up the complexity in your scene, because at the earlier stages of the workflow, it's paramount to have an uncluttered view at your scene and also responsive viewport. Here we have some interesting shader that we can apply later on, and now maybe replace it with the emissive shader. Yeah, I think that will work. And look at this. Very little difference whatsoever. Who cares, it's a simple emissive shader after all, which occupies 10 square pixels. Nobody cares. What everyone cares about is the general look and feel, and it depends mostly on the lighting setup and on the general properties of the material like glossiness and stuff like that. Alright, let's talk a bit about group instances. I want to copy this pod a few times, this heavily decimated model. So I want to use group instances or the Group Pro add-on, about which I will talk a bit later on. Okay, so group instances will be needed to keep the scene uncluttered. Alright, so I will select all the objects which compose this mega object and place it in the center of the coordinates. Then I will press Ctrl G to create a group. After that you can go Shift A, Group Instance, and select this group that you created. And it will create the instance of that group. It will no longer be editable, which kind of sucks, and Group Pro add-on fixes this. But anyway, the group instances will inherit the changes that you make to the source model, which is pretty convenient. For example, you can take the source model, do something with it, and notice how the changes are being propagated to all other group instances. And if you move the object or scale them or rotate, it will also affect all the instances, so this looks mesmerizing, I think. Oh, where am I? What is this? God damn it. Send the help? Great. As I've said, there is an alternative to standard Blender instances, and that is the Group Pro add-on, which is a paid add-on. So I recommend you to check it out. Okay, here I will select all objects. Then I will press Ctrl X, create group. That will create the group instance, and you don't have to place the object in the center of coordinates. It will work straight out of the box. And then we can duplicate these groups like this. And if you want to edit anything, hit Ctrl X, edit group, make your tweaks. And by the way, one of the benefits of this add-on is that you can edit not only the source object, but any instance. Oh, that looks awesome, by the way. It's my Freudian improvisation, you know? Okay, then hit Ctrl X again and close group. Now you can manipulate this bunch of objects again as one object, which is very cool. And the other thing that I want to emphasize, it's very important to learn how to navigate in the viewport, like a pro. It's so obvious that it's very easy to neglect. So you can hit Shift F to enter the first person mode, everybody knows it, but also you can place the 3D cursor and use it as a pivot point for the camera. Just pick 3D cursor in the pivot point mode, Select camera, then press R twice to rotate the camera, trackball style. And using this simple technique, you can orbit around the point, which is very convenient and allows for very fluent changes in camera angle. And you can press G and Z 2 times to move camera forward or backwards. And when you no longer think about navigation, when it's automatic, everything changes. It opens a whole lot of creative possibilities. The next thing I want to talk about is the focal length of the camera. If you have some knowledge of photography and lenses and optics, you know that changing the focal length of the lens affects the image in a big way. Like the higher you go, like 50 millimeters, 120 millimeters, the less perspective convergence you will see. And the wide-angle lenses like 80 millimeters will give you this distorted look with the emphasis on the depth. You can go over the top with something like 3 millimeter lens, an alien vision type of lens, I don't know. Another thing that we can tweak is the sensor size. By tweaking this parameter, you can manipulate how big the virtual sensor of the Blender camera is. I hope that makes sense. Okay, what I really wanted to try for this scene is the panoramic camera. You can select fisheye, equi-solid, equidistant, equi-rectangular. These are various types of fisheye cameras, basically. The equi-rectangular camera gives you the full 360 degrees view on your scene. It's a spherical panorama. It can look very intriguing, but not this time probably. I will stick to the fisheye equi-solid with the field of view that encompasses the whole image, 256 in my case, and you can experiment with the focal length for the panoramic camera as well as for the normal camera. But it's very easy to cross the border between a creative experiment and a total crap. So 15mm equi-solid fisheye, our choice. And the next exciting opportunity to screw your project or to beautify it immensely is to use depth of field. And you can see here I have the focus object, which is just an empty object. Then you can go to the camera settings, pick it as a focus, and change the size of the aperture. I'm aiming to get very shallow depth of field, a very dreamy look, so I will set the size to 5. That is a pretty high value. And then I will play with the focus point. The next step in my workflow, almost usual, is set up mixed lighting of some kind. In this particular project, it involved environment lighting, emissive shaders, area lights. This is our dominant source of lighting. Omni lights, and finally spotlights for the accents. These bright, colorful nuances really help to drag the viewer's eye to the focal point of the composition. As I've said, the area lights are our dominant light source, the main light source. It's a good practice to have one main light source which defines the shape of the model and pretty much don't allow the other light sources to struggle with it. That being said, you can still have light accents. Alright, I also used some supplementary light sources like this, 2 Omni lights. Very weak, because if you really crank it up, it will overpower the main light source, which is not good. So to maintain the balance, I will keep the Omni lights very subtle. And the fifth element is the spotlights. If you select the spotlight, you will see that it's a tiny spotlight with a very small size and a very sharp angle, like 2 degrees, something like that. So it's like a very powerful but very small ray of light. And for the background, I separated the actual lighting from the background and the color of the background using the light path node with the camera ray plugged into the mix factor of the mix shader. So here we have 2 backgrounds, one for lighting and the other for the camera display. This, of course, is not a physically correct way of doing things, but it puts you in control, which is probably a good thing if you want to be able to design every aspect of the project. If you want to have a totalitarian control and bend even the rule of physics to your iron will. Yeah, that's what we 3D artists do. We build hierarchies of dominance. Stop it, Gleb. So we have environment, emissive shaders, area lights, omni-lights, and spotlights. A mixed bag of lights. And the next thing to take care of is Filmic color management. I think it became de facto a standard among Blender users. You can choose Filmic color management instead the default color management, and there are a bunch of benefits to the Filmic color management. And perhaps the biggest benefit of Filmic is that you can tone map the wider luminosity range to low dynamic range displays, basically. It becomes very important when you have to deal with very bright pixels, higher exposure on your images, with HDR panoramas, stuff like that. If you look at this set of images, you will be able to spot the difference of how Filmic treats very bright pixels compared to how the default color management does it. See how Filmic gently desaturates the colors when it comes to the high end, and the default tone mapping just makes everything burned out. Generally, I think Filmic emulation is way to go, and in this particular project we will have at least one shot that will benefit greatly from Filmic. This one. To demonstrate this clearly, let's set the exposure higher. We are using the default tone mapping here, and you can see how the colors quickly get oversaturated. This dreadful shade of orange shows up, and when we switch to Filmic, we see the work of different algorithms, which keeps the saturation at bay, and I think it looks more realistic even. And after doing this, we can play with the contrast to our liking. By the way, you can check the HDR image-based lighting course on creativeshrimp.com. It's free, or rather freemium, so feel free to check it out. And here I'm making off splits into two mini making offs. First we'll talk about rendering and denoising the still shot, and later on we'll create an animation. I think we're ready to render this frame. I will set the render samples to 850, bounces to 2, because now we can afford it. The resolution for the final render will be 200% of 1080p, but for now I will leave it at 100% and only 200 samples, to see if we have some unpredictable glitches, things we want to tweak, because it really sucks when you wait 3 hours for render to finish, only to discover that some pixels are off, or better yet, half of the image is pink for some reason, you lost some textures. Right, and now it's probably a good time to apply at least some kind of post-processing, maybe lens distortion for a chromatic aberration effect, and a little bit of a glare to emphasize the bright spots. I'm very cautious of pushing the post-processing above the certain limits, because then it starts to look really cheesy. It's much better to keep it subtle. I will make one more render with denoising enabled. I think it's a wonderful feature, a complete game changer for Blender, especially if you're into animation or architectural visualization and you have to render camera fly-throughs, stuff like that. Of course, noise reduction has its own flaws, its imperfections, artifacts, but usually, at least in my experience, the benefits of noise reduction far outweighs the negative sides. Here you can see a comparison shot of 50 samples and 50 samples denoised, which took 48 seconds instead of 32, but anyway. And here is 300 samples and 300 samples denoised. It's getting pretty hard to spot the difference, but there is a difference. In this scene is very obvious. Or you can render two versions, one with denoiser enabled and the other just raw version, and blend it together. Okay folks, while we're still on it, let's post-process our image in Krita. My post-processing chain consists of very routine steps, like brightening up the center of interest, adding some dust, grain, and applying RGB curves, something along these lines. Often it makes hell of a difference. By the way, noise reduction also can be done in Krita and in Gimp. For example, you can apply Gaussian noise reducer, filter, and you apply it to the duplicate of the original image. Then you use a transparency mask, over here. Fill the transparency mask layer with black to hide it. Then pick a soft white brush and start working on the noisy areas. This takes more time than automatic solution in Blender, but in some cases it's much more precise because it happens under your control. Other than that, I usually add a little bit of sharpen to some areas at least. Tweak RGB curves to crank up the contrast. You can see this S-shaped curve. Turn up, turn down the saturation, depending on the image, I guess. Add a little bit of a soft light to the center of the image. Basically, it's a few smooth strokes of the white brush with the addition or overlay mode. And then just add in some dust. By the way, it's surprisingly hard to find a good dusty image on the internet. So I have one, which I use in every render since I was a kid, I don't know. And on top of these adjustments, I usually add a film grain, a real film grain, which I apply using the overlay mode, something like that. An alternative to Krita is, of course, Gimp. It's also free, open source, pretty amazing, but not without flaws, like every software, I guess. And it also has pretty good denoising options. Let's explore them. So imagine you have this noisy image. Install Gimp. Install Gimp add-on. I hope that I pronounce it correctly, because otherwise it will be embarrassing. And inside this plugin you will have Repair tab. There you can pick Ions Fast Denoise and Ions Noise Reduction, and both of these denoisers do their job very well. The first one is a little bit on the softer side, and the second one allows for more details recovered, stuff like that. I guess they do a kind of bilateral noise under the hood. In some cases it works as good as Blender denoising, so give it a shot. And now when we are finished with rendering the still shots, it's time for really exciting things. I mean, animation, handheld camera motion. I think we really deserved it. Let's shake it. In the middle of this mini project that took just, I think, 1 or 2 days, I realized that I desperately want to make an animated shot of this padded pod by MasterXeon. Oh gosh, I want to do a handheld camera motion type of thing with just a little bit of Video Copilot vibe to it. You know what I mean? So I used this very simple camera rig, which is just a hierarchy of 3 cubes, parented to each other, and the camera parented to the first cube. Of course, you can watch a tutorial on Creative Shrimp about it, blah blah blah. Anyway, here we have this simplistic rig, and this rig is parented to a camera aim object, and each element of this group is animated separately, and together they form this handheld animation. I think small touches like this really help to sell the animation that you're making. It really grounds it in material reality, as if you're operating the real camera with real lenses and optics, which shakes when you move. And in some mysterious way, it adds a lot of credibility to the animation, especially when you're rendering something sci-fi-ish, like this padded pod. This touch of real-world physics really spices it up. It's a very good way to present things, I think. Or maybe it isn't, depending on your project, who knows? Anyway, here we have the camera aim, which is rotating, and the other stuff is parented to it. Then we have these cubes, each of them have their own animation, and here you can see a chaotic motion. What is it? Let's go over to the dope sheet, delete all keyframes, and redo it. First, I will enable this small button, which is automatic keyframe insertion, and I will hit R 2 times in the viewport to shake the camera like this in real time. So first I will press Alt-A to begin the animation, and then I will shake the camera. I'm doing it badly right now just to demonstrate the effect. And what happened is that our camera shake, so to speak, got recorded. It looks very natural because that jerking animations of your hand, and then this automatic keyframes is like motion capture. And I used the same technique for animating the focus object for the camera, as if the camera is hunting for focus, which happens in the low light conditions like this. So then the feel and the look of animation is right. One last step is to render it out in an efficient manner. And actually here you can see 4 animations because I ended up creating 4 animations instead of 1. It's the temptation of 3D. You know, when you have a scene set up, what you need to do is just set up a bunch of cameras and render it out. And bam, you have a video which is bigger than the sum of the components. That's amazing when it happens. So for the preview render, I try to keep the settings very low. And before actually starting out the render, I want to preview the camera motion. I will press render, open GL render animation. It won't look quite the same as Cycles render for obvious reasons, one of which is that the OpenGL render won't show the fisheye camera at all. But anyway, it's a good approximation for the camera jerkiness, and I really want to make sure that I didn't go over the top, because it can easily ruin the whole shot if you have few jerky frames. And after I made sure that everything looks okay, I will set the resolution to 30% of 1080p, frame skip to 3 to render each third frame, and the render samples to 35, very low amount. The point of these shenanigans is to render a low quality approximation of the animation, to grasp the overall look and feel, to reveal the glitches, to gain the confidence in the final result, or to get a reason to redo everything from scratch, if you're unlucky. Alright dudes, behold the glorious result, and let's switch the denoising on. I think it gives us a decent approximation of the final look, especially combined with the OpenGL render preview, which gives us an information about camera motion in the first place. And then you combine these two approximations in your mind, which is a damn good mental exercise. So after rendering the first shot, I moved the cameras to other place, the whole rig, tweaked the animation of course, enabled the auto keyframes again, press Alt-A, shaked the camera, tried to create a balanced, dynamic, rhythmic composition. I think it worked pretty damn good, because we had an awesome model to start with. Then we aimed at creating the artistic representation of this model. In other words, I just wanted to make it A, look appealing, B, have some special element in it to make it stand out, and in case of this project, it was fisheye camera and very dreamy, shallow depth of field. And of course, ultimately, it depends on the type of effect that you want to achieve. If you're aiming at showing and selling the geometry of the object itself, you may want a less weird and dreamy representation. But if you're aiming at a strong visual impression, dramatic lighting, and artistic look, this could be a good opportunity to experiment and try something different. Oh, and this is preview of the frame number 3, 45 samples, 50% of 1080p resolution. Renders blazing fast, is noisy as hell afterwards, but nobody cares. After all, we just want to preview the animations and let it run overnight. Right, awesome. And this was the final shot, the 4th shot of the project, featuring even stronger depth of field and the HardOps logo. After all, if it was an advertisement, it could have a logo in it, right? That makes perfect sense. And I'll tell you, this was the hardest shit to render. Noisy as hell. Denoising really doesn't help in this case, because you need a lot of samples anyway. I really want to reiterate that point. We haven't really touched the model, we just optimized it a little bit, and we haven't changed the shaders radically. What we did is we made a bunch of creative choices about cameras, lighting, rendering, overall look and feel, and of course composition to arrive at this point where we get something decent, and I really love the result. I think it's mainly because it's based on the awesome model by MasterXeon. Visit his YouTube channel for the hard surface modeling tutorials, hard ops add-on updates, time lapses and other exciting stuff. Right, and that was Gleb, Alexandrov for creativeshrimp.com. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial in particular and this format. Join the discussion in the comments below and let me know if you liked it or not.
Initiating launch sequence.
And please share this video because it's very important for me and for all the nerds